Hello and welcome back to SteelCast, Tata Steel's very own podcast about all things steel. Now it's been a few weeks since our previous episode and a lot's happened in that time. Just to give you a run through, we've closed Blast Furnace 5, we've closed Continuous Caster 2 in the Boss plant, and we've had our last shipment of iron ore into our deep water harbour here up at Talbot. Now that last episode of SteelCast was with Swansea-based company Marine Power Systems, who are very much looking into the future for use of our site and use of our green steel to create wind turbines for offshore wind, floating offshore wind, based on our Talbot site. Now, before we even get to that stage, we need to transition to our electric arc furnace steelmaking, and that all begins with planning. Now, I'm very pleased to say we're joined by Natalie Young today. Natalie is Tata Steel UK's head of property and planning. So Natalie, first off, welcome to SteelCast. I will jump right in with the first question. Our electric arc furnace is being housed in our current Boss plant, yes. Which is on our land, it's our building. So people may be forgiven for thinking we may not need planning permission for such a thing, but that's not quite true, is it?
No, that's not quite right. So whilst the EAF itself and the two ladle furnaces will be inside the Boss plant, we're going to need to build an awful lot of other infrastructure around that to make it function, and some of that will be outside the buildings, and a development of this scale will require planning permission. So it's very similar to, it's the same regime as when people need to get an extension on their house and other things that people have probably done in their lifetimes, but it's a kind of beefed up version of that process. And we have two other statutory regimes that overlay that process. One of those relates to environmental assessments. So we need to carry out something called an Environment Impact Assessment, or an EIA. And we also need to deal with the sustainable drainage regulations, which are applicable in Wales. So we've got three statutory regimes we need to address in order to get permission to build the EAF and everything that makes it function.
The announcement was made in January that we will be transitioning from blast furnaces to an electric arc furnace. And since then, I've seen comments online and even comments inside the works. So people are a little concerned that we haven't applied for planning permission yet. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen, does it?
No, not at all. It's a lengthy process. It's very rigorous. So as part of the planning process and the environmental impact assessment, we need to look at noise, we need to look at light, we need to look at visual impact, we need to look at transport impacts, heritage. There are more than a dozen chapters and specialist disciplines that we need to assess in order to get permission to carry this development out. And some of those have inherent timeframes in them. So, for example, on ecology, we need to carry out 4 seasons worth of surveys to look at all the various species that we have on site of flora and fauna. So you need one in spring, one in summer, one in autumn and one in winter. And that automatically means you've got a year factored into your timetable to pull together a robust application. And if you don't include that information, your planning application is automatically invalid because you haven't entered all the information that you need to in order for people to make a decision. So you've already got 1 year guaranteed in the preparation of the planning application from that aspect alone. So we are in the midst of pulling all of that information together to make sure we have as robust a planning application as possible to submit. And we're now at the point where we can talk at a high level with people about all the work we've done. So far there's been more than 1,000 hours worth of work from our consultant team internally and from our Tata personnel on this project, probably the same from the local planning authority, and then also from other stakeholders going in. So there are many thousands of hours of work that have gone into this, and that's part of the process.
It sounds like there's a lot more to it than people may realise or appreciate. But from a visual point of view then, you mentioned things will be going on inside and outside of the Boss plant and elsewhere on site. What sort of changes can we expect to see over the next few years?
So some of them will be relatively minor. So if I walk us through the processes that will happen in practice, I can point things out as we go. So we'll be bringing about 70,000 tonnes of scrap in per day on the rail line. Obviously we've got an existing rail line on which we bring materials in already, but we have got a pinch point on that rail line. So we're going to need to double some of that rail line, less than a kilometre, but it's an important practical bottleneck that we're removing as part of this development. So people won't see a significant change in that area. We've always had a rail line there, but there will be development happening there. That then brings that scrap into our existing scrapyard, but that is not built for a capacity to take the sort of volumes that we're going to need to bring in to do the AF. So we're going to need to upgrade the scrap facilities. And we've we've built that into the planning application. So from the scrapyard then, we take the scrap by vehicle to the Consteel, and that's probably the most significant external structure that we will add. So that is effectively a continuous conveyor that takes the scrap in, heats it, melts it and transports it to the AF inside the Boss plant. So that's going to involve a new structure that won't be particularly visible from the Port Talbot community side because we've got Cold Mill and Capel there that shield it. But from an elevated perspective on the hillside or from an elevated point on the M4, you might be able to see it, and certainly all of our steel workers and people that come on site will be able to see it, and it'll be new for them.
Yeah, great. So some of the things that are visible from the M4 right now are the likes of the sinter plant and the blast furnaces, which are going to be decommissioned. What's going to happen to that land and the assets that sit upon it?
So we're going to need to make those assets safe. So we have committed to decommission those. It's important that we do some quite, they're not very sexy tasks, to be honest with you. They're things like draining tanks, cutting, capping, purging pipes, making electrical services safe and isolating them. These are things that people can hurt themselves on and do themselves damage on. So we need to tackle all of those and make sure that we make it safe. We also need to comply with our obligations in our environment permit. When we wrap up a service and cease doing it on site, we have certain obligations environmentally that we need to do, and then to get Natural Resources Wales to sign off on. So we'll do that, but there's no plan at this point in time to take it any further. So the structures that everybody's familiar with on the skyline are not planned to be demolished by us at this time.
Okay, I see. And this transformation is massive. It's £1.25 billion. But that's not just for the electric arc furnace, is it? There's other assets as well. For instance, the scrapyards you've mentioned. We need new scrapyards, new methods of handling the scrap that comes in to feed the furnace, and also the continuous casters. While 2's gone off, 1 and 3 will remain. They're having life extension programs we can use with the EAF. We're having a new pickle line and some refurbishment work to the hot mill, aren't we? So what sort of planning application or planning works involved with those assets?
So the hot mill's quite straightforward. That's a maintenance programme. So we're replacing the crop shear and the coil box. So we're doing like-for-like essential replacement, which you don't need to go and get planning for. That's a maintenance job. For the pickle line that sits inside the building in the cold mill, we're unlikely to need planning for that, but we do need to do an EIA screening when we've got full details just to make sure. But there will be other parts of the development around the cold mill that are external to that building. So we're looking at things like an acid recycling plant and other bits like that will require a planning application at the right time, but it'll be a separate one to the EAF because those works are necessary to make the cold mill fit for purpose, whether we've got a blast furnace feeding it, whether we're re-rolling, and whether we've got an EAF running. It's agnostic, so we need to do it as a separate project. Yeah. But it is part of the 1.25 billion.
Yeah, and like any other time, those will be massive projects in themselves, but they're sort of overshadowed by the installation of our new electric arc furnace. But this 1.25 billion pound is the biggest single investment into the steel industry in the UK in decades, and it's not just for us. It's also keeping steel making alive in Port Talbot. So it's good for the community in the long run. And the community are one of the key stakeholders that we want to engage with as part of the planning process. And we've held events. We're at one today. We held one last week where our head of public relations, Tim Rutter, he caught up with Andrea Kelleher from our consultants Turley to find out more. Let's check that out.
So today we've come to Tybark Community Centre on the edge of the Port Talbot Steelworks, and we're holding a session for the local community to understand a bit more about the exciting plans that are in place to develop the Port Talbot Steelworks for its low carbon future. I've got with me today Andrea Kelleher. She's a communications advisor from Turley's. And Andrea, tell me why these sort of events are important as we go through planning.
Yeah, so we like to come out to the community to inform them about the plans that we're bringing forward, and we find that it encourages some participation so that we can get feedback from the community on what they think about our proposals before we put in a planning application.
Yeah, so there's just this event, but there's more coming, isn't there? You're doing a number of these events across Port Talbot, but it's not all we're doing, is it? There's other communications with the community to make sure they know what we're doing and give them an opportunity to feedback.
Absolutely. So we've got a lot of online engagement as well. So our project website at greensteelfuture.com. People can find out more information about the EAF there. We've got information out on social media, through the press. We've got several events taking place, and we held an online webinar event as well, so people can find out more information there.
Yeah, so I know we had the employee event recently in the works where employees could come and have a chat about what's going on. As you said, we had the webinar online yesterday. There's a number of these events. We've been here for a couple of hours this evening. What are the sort of topics that people are generally asking questions about?
Yeah, I mean, the legacy of the steelworks is really important to people. So information about what's going to happen with the blast furnaces, as well as people are really interested in the future. So what are the benefits of moving to an electric arc furnace? What does that mean for the people of Port Talbot? So in terms of environmental benefits and what the community would see through this new scheme is something that we've had a lot of questions on today.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying this is kind of pre-application consultation. I'm not sure if that's the right phraseology, but where it goes into a more formal process where we have to consult with key stakeholders as well. When's that happening and what does that look like?
Yep, so we're in the kind of initial pre-application stage at the moment, and then in September we'll hold the formal consultation. So that's when we'll have more detail on the planning application documents, and they'll all be available on the website, but people can look and delve a little bit further into the detail, whereas today we're giving people more of a high-level overview and taking that feedback in before we finalise the plans moving forwards.
Yeah, and I see on the table behind us there are some forms that people can fill in with their thoughts, questions, concerns. What's the process for dealing with those concerns in the planning application about how we might address them or mitigate any of those concerns? Is that part of the formal planning process, is it?
Absolutely. So we need to submit something that's called a pre-application consultation report, and that explains how we engaged with the community and how we've met the requirements, but it also includes what people have said and how we've considered their feedback as part of our design process. So we need to show the council and the decision maker how we've taken people's views into account. So that's a great report to look at when the application is submitted later this year.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Andrea, because I've been here talking to people already this afternoon, and people have got their concerns, but generally I think people are quite positive about what the company is doing. They understand the impact on the people, but certainly the locals have been concerned about environmental impact of the steelworks for many years, and they can see an improvement there, and they see it as a sort of a progression that any industry would go through. Is that the feeling you're getting?
Yeah, people know that things need to change, and that although there is the legacy and the history of the steelworks, that we need to find a new way to make steel that is more environmentally friendly. And I think people are really happy to see that Tata Steel are here to stay, and that they have an aspiration to continue making steel at Port Talbot.
Brilliant, thanks Andrea. So there we are, here we are at Tye Bar Community Centre with members of the local community. There are more sessions planned in and around Port Talbot over the coming days, and it's all part of the planning process which will come to a head later this year when we put the formal planning application in, and then hopefully that will be approved such we can put spades in the ground from next July or August. Thanks very much for joining us, Andrea.
Thank you.
So these community events, they're vital, aren't they, to engage with the community. They can voice their opinions and concerns about our transformation. But it's not just us going through this transformation. Steel companies across the world are moving away from blast furnaces, moving more towards electric arc furnace technology. And also in the UK, British Steel announced they've applied for planning permission for 2 electric arc furnaces of their own, one in Teesside, one in Scunthorpe. Are they sort of further along than us?
No, so we've taken a slightly different approach strategically to British Steel. So just taking this a step back into some really technical planning information. There are 2 different types of planning you can go for, and then you can combine them to make a hybrid application. And both Tata and British Steel have gone for the hybrid option. So one of those kinds of planning is an outline planning permission, and that's usually used by someone when they want to test the water as to whether they're likely to get permission for something in a particular location or whether they need to look at another location. And they will put in enough information to say, this is the sort of thing we're thinking of putting in there. It will be no worse than this, no higher than this, no bigger than this. Will we get permission if we come back to you with more detailed information? And that's really what an outline's for. It's often used by house builders to get a feeling as to whether they'll get residential in that area or not. So Then there's also the full type of planning permission, and that is where you put all the detailed information in and say, this is exactly what I want to build. Will you give me permission to build it, albeit it may be with conditions attached? So we've each gone for a hybrid application. British Steel have got detailed permission for both of their EAFs and then for one compressor building at Scunthorpe. But the remainder of the plant around that, so your fume extraction plants, your water treatment plants, your electrical outbuildings, are in outline. So they're in that less detailed kind of work. So they've got planning permission where they can start and build the 2 EAFs and the compressor building, but not the remainder. The remainder they'll need to go back through the process through something called the reserved matters process. So they're part way through and they've done very well with it. Congratulations to them. We've taken the approach that we wanted to start to build as quickly as possible, so we've put as much as possible into detailed planning permission. So we're not just putting our EAF in, we are doing all of the detailed work on the fume extraction plant, the consteel, the electrical outbuildings, the water treatment plant, everything else that goes into making the EAF function, we're putting in detailed design. The only bits we're putting in outline design are the National Grid compound that they're building on our site, because they're designing that, and the scrapyard, because we've got a number of strategic options as to how we approach that. So that detail will follow at a later point. But that then enables us to start building everything, not just the EAF, every other bit of plant around it that's going to be required to make it function, which we felt would give us a quicker build programme and end up with the EAF coming online sooner.
Yeah, so again, a lot of work involved. Our plans are being submitted in November, I believe, yeah. And we're not expecting to hear anything back until around springtime 2025. What happens in that meantime? What can we do?
So there's actually quite a lot that goes on in the background during that time. So we're in informal consultation now, as we've already discussed. We do a formal consultation with all of the documentation and the public in September. And then we submit, after we've taken that into account, listened to everybody's thoughts, taken anything that we need to into the application, we submit that in November. And then there will be a programme of where all of the stakeholders look at that, assess it, go through it, and then we'll need to liaise with the local planning authority to agree a Section 106 agreement at the same time. So that is an agreement that deals with all of the community benefits that will go hand in hand if we get the planning application. So that needs to be negotiated, and we also need to discuss then any conditions that need to be attached to that planning permission, and that period can sensibly be used to get those agreed, ready for the decision, which will hopefully be positive then in the spring.
Okay, what if it isn't so positive? Is it a possibility it could be rejected, and sort of what happens then?
So, great question. So the first thing to do is make sure you've got your team in place with all of the necessary expertise and experience. So for me, I've been doing this for 20 years, and a lot of our team bring that sort of experience and longer on doing these applications. So we've delivered them successfully for a long time, and we've got a good track record and a good understanding of the system. We've also got on this particular team people who have obtained planning permission for different things on the Port Talbot site for more than 10 years. So most of this team worked on the planning permission for the power plant, and we've done a lot of smaller ones in between, which other people may not have noticed quite so much. But we've had planning permissions for the sinter plant, for raw materials bunkers, for gates, for other structures on site that haven't had very much attention, but they require the same process. And we've gone through that hand in hand with the local planning authority and the other relevant stakeholders. So we understand what they're going to need from us and what we need to deliver to get the right decision. So combination of right skills, right experience, doing all the hard work, the thousands of hours that I was talking to you about, and making sure that when we put it in, nothing's missing and we've addressed all of the points of concern. That's a big point. And then it's about engagement. So we've spent more than 7 months now liaising with the local council, with Natural Resources Wales, with other relevant authorities on heritage, highways, health. So it's important that we have been getting their feedback and building that into the application and addressing their concerns. And now we're bringing that pack, which is much more developed and more fulsome, out to the public so we can listen to their concerns and incorporate those. And that should minimise the risk of any refusal.
Yeah, so plans obviously well underway, looking like full steam ahead, hopefully in spring, summer next year. Natalie, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate taking time out your busy schedule there. So this is it for this episode of SteelCast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, whatever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, we're gonna be following this journey. There's gonna be a lot of highs and a lot of lows. but we're planning to document as much as we can during our transition. You can follow us on YouTube, Tata Steel UK, as well as other social media sites. That's it for this week. See you next time.